Martin Luther King wanted blacks to be admitted to the University of Alabama so that they too could share the treasures of Western civilization, so that they too could read Shakespeare. That's a very different understanding of how we solve the problem. But now the understanding is the way we solve the problem is that we have to purge Shakespeare and purge Milton. You can't build a civilization on never-ending destruction. But that's what identity politics does, because it sees stain everywhere.
Well, welcome to Freedom Feature. I'm Barry Bussey. Today, our special guest is Dr. Joshua Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is professor of political theory at Georgetown University. He's the author of numerous journal articles, 4 books, including the one we'll be speaking about today, American Awakening, Identity Politics and Other Afflictions of Our Time. Welcome to our program, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I wonder if you could just share with our audience a little bit about your background and what's motivating you in your writing.
I did receive a PhD in political theory, but I spent a lot of time at the University of Chicago Divinity School as well. And so I have always tended to look at politics through the lens of theology, Christianity in particular. When identity politics began to emerge, it's hard to pick a date. Some people want to date it to the 60s. I think it's much more recent. It became quite clear to me that some of the central categories of identity politics are deeply theological categories. In fact, can't be understood apart from theology. And if you know much about American history, you know that periodically we've had these religious upheavals. And my argument in the book is we're in the midst of another great religious upheaval. It's called identity politics, and it is, in my view, a great awakening without God and without forgiveness.
One of the things I very much appreciated in your book is the fact that you're not shy at all about referencing Christianity. And that is something, certainly here in Canada, we don't see that kind of scholarship where there's this drawing the dots, as it were, or connecting the dots. Looking at our past, in Canada, we kind of have this mindset, well, you know, that was then, this is now. And religion really doesn't have any part to play any longer. Reading your book, you're pointing out, well, hey, no, listen, there's some connecting of dots that's necessary. But before we get deep into your book, I'm just wondering, I've noticed your other books you have as well on de Tocqueville. Now, de Tocqueville is someone that I have always been very interested in myself. In fact, I'm working on a project now with Professor Hans Martin Tenapel over at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. We're working on a book project dealing with de Tocqueville. And I'm wondering if you could just share with our audience a little bit about who de Tocqueville is. And I'm very curious to know what your interest is with respect to him and why you think he's so important today.
So before I finished up my PhD at University of Chicago, I was out at the University of Washington studying social theory. So I read Marx very carefully, and Max Weber, one of the other great social theorists, and a bit of de Tocqueville. And after all of these years, which is to say from the early 80s, my conclusion is that there's only one man standing from the great 19th century thinkers, and that's Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a Frenchman who came from a long aristocratic family, came to the United States in the early 1830s, and realized that something really, really important was happening. He saw that the future was democracy, and this is important. We see that democracy's won. But in the 19th century, it wasn't clear at all that democracy was going to win. And that's why I raised the fact that he was from an aristocratic family. Many aristocrats and many of Tocqueville's friends thought that the French Revolution was this little experiment in equality, but we would put it back in the bag and it'd be all over. And Tocqueville saw in the early 1830s, especially when he came to North America, he realized that no, this is the future. And his great worry was that while it was immensely promising, this thing called democracy, it might end up, to use my language, in a kinder and gentler despotism at the end of history, where you and I would be lonely and isolated from one another. We would practice social distancing, if you want to use that language. That's exactly what we would do. And we would look up to the powerful state. And he says in one prophetic passage at the end of Democracy in America, which is his great book, he says, I foresee a time in the future where citizens will fold themselves into a smaller and smaller circles. They would look up to the state that would take care of it, and the state would only care that its citizens, or rather subjects, were entertained. And so I look at the COVID lockdown regime, and again, I don't want to be anti-lockdown. I think we have to have a reasonable understanding this is a serious medical problem. But in terms of what it created, it was actually the preconditions for the tyranny that Tocqueville worried about. We would download Netflix and YouTube. The state would tell us what our next step was. We wouldn't shake hands or touch people. We wouldn't be involved in other people. This is exactly the worry that Tocqueville had for the distant future. So I think he's the great prophet of democracy. He shows what we have to do, and he shows what will happen if we don't do it.
Are you able to give us a wee bit of what is it that he is recommending for us to be doing today?
Well, there's lots of things, but let me talk about this in the context of the debates between globalists and nationalists.
Okay.
Tocqueville thought that human beings had to avoid the temptation of letting their imagination wander to universal ideas. He thought that's what the French Revolution gave us, the idea of the universal rights of man. And while he's all for rights, his view is what had happened with the French Revolution is that the links that tied people to one another had been cut. And as a consequence, people dreamed of universal justice, but didn't pay attention to their neighbors anymore. And so his view was, in order for us to live well, we have to have palpable human connections to our neighbors. And so he thought the only way you could do that would be to be in a nation. He didn't recommend nationalism. This wasn't some sort of irrational love of blood and soil. He was completely against that. But we have to live with our nations. We're citizens of a nation. We pay attention to our Constitution and our laws. But then more importantly, if we're going to survive, we have to have strong connections to our families, to our religious institutions, to our local communities. This is the only thing that would allow us not to fall into depression, because one of the things I don't think people fully understand is that he predicted, and I talk about this a bit in the book, he predicted this problem of bipolarity and manic depression. He thought this would be an inevitable consequence of you and I becoming more and more delinked and isolated and alone. So whereas we want to treat it in the beginning of the 21st century as a medical problem, a brain chemistry problem, Tocqueville in the mid and early 19th century thought, no, this is going to be a consequence. We're going to have this bipolarity problem as a consequence of losing our connections to one another. And so he predicted that in the democratic age, there would be madness on a scale that we'd never seen in an earlier age. And you look at the amount of both legal and illegal substances that are circulating in advanced democracies, and I'll speak about the United States. It's just completely out of control in the United States. You'll have to tell me what it's like in Canada. But he predicted all of this, and he thought the only remedy for drug use, for the incredible rates of depression and despair among our youth, the only remedy is if we get off of these abstract ideas and go greet our neighbor and build a world together.
Wow, that is powerful. And it's certainly something that resonates after these 2.5+ years, whatever, of isolation. How prescient of him to be able to look into democracy and see these faults that are built right in our system that we have to be ever mindful of.
Oftentimes I hear in universities everywhere I go, I hear this phrase, transitions to democracy, as if democracy is the universal stable form and everything else is unstable. If we can just kind of bump along the authoritarians and bring people from the so-called third world into the modern age, we'll all be democratic. What Tocqueville saw is this thing called democracy can be really wonderful. It unleashes natural affection for people. We don't have to think in terms of social class anymore. Above all, it makes us attuned to the suffering of others. That's very, very important. But what he worried about is that democracy is not stable at all. It's profoundly unstable. And that the likely outcome, unless we work really, really hard, is, to use the phrase I just gave you a few minutes ago, a kind of gentle despotism at the end of history, where people aren't forced at gunpoint to give up their freedom. It just becomes too difficult. It's too difficult to work with your neighbor. Let's just look up to the powerful state that will tell us the rules by which we live. The state will take care of us cradle to grave. We actually don't need our parents. We don't need to take care of our grandparents. We don't need to have any connections to any other human being. because Amazon will deliver our packages, Netflix will deliver our entertainment, and the state will tell us what to do. I mean, this was his worry. And remember, the problem in the 19th century was, is democracy justifiable? And he thought it's only justifiable if we build this world together. And if we build this world together, meaning face-to-face associations in our local communities and our strong families, if we could do that, he says, quote, it would unleash an energy never before seen in human civilization. That's if we work together in these face-to-face relations. The problem is, if we give up on those, we'll have loneliness and isolation. And instead of this incredible energy and development and growth and development of competence among citizens, instead of that, we would have an infantile citizenry that can't take care of itself, that the state needs to step in to care for. It's a very dire picture that he gives us. He doesn't say it's inevitable, but he says unless we work really hard to build a world in that difficult space of our neighborhoods and our families and our religious institutions, if we don't do that, then we'll reach this kinder and gentler despotism. He was a prophet of the future.
It just came to mind as well. I remember studying a wee bit in the ancient Rome, the idea of the Caesars wanting to provide Romans with the circus and bread. You know, as long as you looked after those two things, like you say, the entertainment, the food, and so forth, then we have the people. Is there any kind of similarity between the fall? Now, granted, that was not a democracy per se, but the fall of Rome to this same kind of isolation. I think also of Hannah Arendt, who talks about loneliness in her writing.
So on the matter of Hannah Arendt took Alexis de Tocqueville very seriously. And for example, in the book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she saw exactly what Tocqueville saw, was that the precondition of totalitarianism is that you cut the links between citizens so that citizens have to depend upon the state. Tocqueville has this wonderful passage. He says, a tyrant will forgive citizens for not loving him, provided they do not love each other. In other words, the precondition for tyranny emerging is that citizens are disconnected, that they're social distancing from one another. This is the precondition for despotism. On the matter of the ancient parallels, it's actually very interesting. So Tocqueville gives a sociological account of why this is happening, namely the links are being broken. But you can see in Augustine, who is in a way the last of the great Roman rhetoricians, he saw this too, but he saw it as a theological problem. That is to say, when human beings aren't looking up to a transcendent God, they will look up to an immanent God. In other words, we're always going to worship a one. It's either going to be the state or the transcendent God. And Tocqueville has a passage like this too. So you can give a theological account of why human beings are always going to worship, and they're either going to worship something that brings them into servitude or that brings them into freedom. This was Augustine's point. Tocqueville has moments where he's thinking theologically, but he's a fallen Catholic. At age 17, he said he lost his faith. But that doesn't mean he didn't worry about this the rest of his life. One of my late colleagues, Peter Lawler, who's a wonderful man, said Tocqueville didn't believe in God, but he worried about what God thought of that. Think about that for a while. It's pretty fun. So Tocqueville has this deep religious sense, and when he calls himself a liberal of a new kind, but what he's suggesting is that he does not think that liberalism can last without this thing called Christianity for all sorts of reasons. Now, he doesn't put his stamp on which sect of Christianity. He's rooting for Catholics, but he just worries that it's not going to survive without something like religion. And just very briefly, for one, it teaches us long-term habits of thinking. For two, and I think this is the most important thing of all, he says, think of the two great commandments: love God above all else and love your neighbor. And he says this is exactly the kind of thing we need to hear in the democratic age, because in this bipolar moment that we find ourselves in, human beings are going to oscillate back and forth between throwing themselves recklessly into the world. This is the frenzy, and then withdrawing into themselves into deep depression. And so he says the love of God first forces us to realize that we're not going to find what we're looking for in the world. And the commandment to love your neighbor pulls you out of yourself, pulls you out of your depression. So the two great commandments speak to exactly the problem of bipolarity in the democratic age. So again, it's more complicated than that because I've taught this now for 35, 40 years. This book, this extraordinary book, and it's not clear ultimately that his account of Christianity and the need for religion is a fully coherent one, and one that you can say, okay, here's what we need to do. But he just worries that if you don't have some deep moral commitment to something that's not passing, he's not convinced that democracy can survive.
One of your recent books, American Awakening, and for those of you who are watching, I'm just going to post a picture of it here. American Awakening, Identity, Politics, and Other Afflictions for Our Time. And I very much encourage you to get a copy because we're going to be talking about this next, and you'll see why it's so very important. First of all, let's start with the modern day mischief, as it were, with respect to what you're trying to, why did you write this book?
I set up in the book two alternatives. One is what I call the liberal politics of competence, in which we greet each other as citizens. We have to depend on each other as citizens. We have to build a world together as citizens. And the great thing we can do is develop competence. So I'm restoring a farmhouse, as I mentioned to you prior to us starting. Mm-hmm. And I've got this wonderful crew. It's an interracial crew. They don't much care about whether they're black or white or Hispanic. They care about whether the drywall goes up well and whether the foundation is built. And I'm saying that's the world we want. I'm very proud of the fact that we have a multicultural country, Canada maybe even more so. I think this is a fantastic thing that we need to have to show that we can build a world together, because the world is more and more interconnected. So I'm all for plurality, for what I call liberal pluralism. I want us to build a world of competence together. To echo the remarks of Martin Luther King so long ago, we need to be concerned with the content of our character rather than the color of our skin. So that's where I think we need to go. And that's what I think we can do. And I believe the constitutional framework in America will allow us to continue to do that. There are so many people who want to tear down the constitutional framework. They say, no, America is corrupt, America is racist. And my response to that is, if you can show me a problem that we can't actually solve within the existing constitutional framework, then I'll be convinced that we need to start over. But there's not one. We had a civil war. We went through the civil rights movement. We can solve our problems with the existing framework. So liberal politics of competence is what I think we all should be aiming for. However, what has now intervened is what I call the politics of innocence and transgression. So rather than you and I looking at each other as possible bearers of competence that we can build a world together on the basis of, instead what's happening is that everybody is looking at each other as one of two things, either a transgressor or an innocent victim. And you can go online and find your intersectional scorecard. So if you're a white heterosexual male, you get no points. You're the prime transgressor. If you're a woman, you get a point. If you're black, you get another point. If you're gay or lesbian, you get another point. And right now, the person with the most innocence points is the transgender movement. So there's a game being played, and that is, how can we figure out who's pure and who's stained? And of course, the idea of the stained one, and this is profoundly Christian, is that there needs to be a scapegoat to take away the sins of the world. Well, that is exactly the Christian formulation. Right. Christ, the divine scapegoat, takes away the sins of the world. And my argument is, even if we haven't had an explicitly Christian culture, this idea of a divine scapegoat who takes away the sins of the world worked its way into the West. And my argument is the only way the West got to pluralism at all was that they realized that the deepest impulse in man, which is to scapegoat other groups. We have to be very clear about this. Human beings aren't, in my view, naturally good. They're naturally a group gathering, and they look at others as possible threats. Mm-hmm. I was born in the Middle East. I spent much of the last 15 years in the Middle East. I know exactly how it works in the Middle East, where one group is considered to be pure, another group is considered to be the scapegoat. You build a kind of terrible politics if you go in that direction. And so the miracle in the West is that we got to the place where we could let go of our group identities enough so that we could see each other as fellow citizens. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement. So my argument is, Christianity has this formula. There's a divine scapegoat who takes away the sins of the world. And the problem is, when Christianity begins to fall, you don't get secularism. We have proof of that. When Christianity began to fall centuries ago, and the first thing we had was what Tocqueville, again, called the incomplete religion of the French Revolution, which sought to, in my view, have the community of saints without God. This is the brotherhood of man. And then the second incomplete religion we got after Christianity began to falter was Marxism, which pointed the way to the end of history, to the end of suffering, gave suffering a meaning, right? It's all for the achievement of capitalism, which then ultimately destroys itself. And my argument is we're in the midst of a third incomplete religion, which is identity politics. So after Christianity falters, you don't get secularism. You get incomplete versions of Christianity cycling time and time again, all of which are threats to this liberal politics of competence. So the way this works very briefly with identity politics is there's a prime transgressor right now. It's the white heterosexual male. And before I even take another breath, I want to assure you and your audience members that I'm disgusted by any kind of racial politics, any kind of racial politics. So I have, because there are people on the alt-right who want to defend whiteness, and I'm disgusted by that as much as I am by people on the left who want to attack whiteness. But here's the way this works. So instead of having a transcendent scapegoat who, for once and for all time, takes away the sins of the world, you have an immanent scapegoat, a scapegoat in the world of time. And for the moment, it's the white heterosexual male. And the idea here is that all the sins of the world can be attributable to him. He's the scapegoat who can take away the sins of the world. So capitalism, the nation state, the heteronormative family, the patriarchal church, dirty fossil fuels that run on that run the capitalist machinery, the dream, in fact, the delusion on the left with identity politics is that if we can just purge the white heterosexual male and all that he's brought in history, which means we have to destroy monuments and everything, we can just do that, then we'll have a world of purity and innocence again. And this is, I think, deeply sick on any number of grounds. But the interesting thing, one of the interesting things that follows is that once you purge your prime transgressor, because you do need to solve the problem of scapegoating in society, you have to find the next one. And my argument is the next one is already lining up. It's this, if you follow the Karen meme, it's white women. But then irony of ironies, I think the next one is black men who believe in the church and believe in the family that contains a man and a woman. Because if you look at Black America and you do the canvassing about what they believe, 80% of them believe in the traditional family. 80% of them believe in the traditional church. And so as you keep moving farther left, you end up attacking the group that's probably the most fragile in America, and to come back to Tocqueville, that needs family and needs the churches most of all. And so my argument is what's happening right now in America is that the left, the Democratic Party, uses the wound of slavery, says America's racist, says it wants to help Black Americans. But in point of fact, as you keep going farther and farther out, right, civil rights goes to women's rights, goes to gay and lesbian rights, goes to transgender rights, you end up getting to a place where in order to be, quote, inclusive, you have to get rid of the crime of believing that a man is a man, as a woman is a woman. This is where the pronoun wars are being fought right now. And so Black America begins as the group that we're supposed to be protecting, and ends by being the group whose institutions identity politics needs to destroy. There's something deeply sick about this. And so the argument that identity politics is trying to point out racial grievances, to me, deeply perverse, because if you take identity politics all the way, you end up attacking the very institutions that Black America needs. And I'm in a number of conversations with prominent Black conservatives. They all know this. They're very, very troubled by this. They're not really speaking up about it yet. But my view is, if you go this route of continuing to look for groups to purge, you end up in a really sick situation where you destroy the very institutions that the least among us, Black, white, Hispanic, everyone, need. Yeah. And this is back to this Tocquevillian point, right? We need to have these institutions. But if the family now is guilty of the crime of heteronormativity, if the church is guilty of the crime of being homophobic, you've got a real problem, because you're going to hurt the very people who need these institutions to climb out of poverty.
You mentioned about French Revolution, which of course de Tocqueville was very concerned with, but it just kind of reminds me of the various phases that revolution went through, and it became even more and more radical as time came along. Soon the revolution was eating its own, right?
Yes.
Literally. I mean, Robespierre
So
and all the rest of them.
this is really important. So as we know, the French Revolution, the nearly the end stage was called the Terror, where everybody started getting their head cut off. And there's a very interesting philosophical question that Tocqueville saw, and actually Hegel saw too, lurking in the French Revolution. If you're committed to universal ideas, how do you respond to people who have particular commitments? And the what they both saw in the by the 1820s, 1830s was that the only possible response you could have if you're committed to universal human rights, the only possible response to somebody who wants to protect their nation, protect their religion, is to destroy them. And what's very troubling to me is the debate, so to speak, between, because I don't think it's a debate, the debate between the cosmopolitan universalists and those who want to protect the nation. The way people who want to protect their nation are portrayed is as if they're racists, authoritarians, homophobes, the whole nine yards. You know how this goes. And while I'm very concerned that nationalism can get out of hand, so make no mistake about this, I am concerned that there can be very unhealthy nationalism. It's once you've entered the framework of universal justice or the cosmopolitan frame of mind, there's no way you can accommodate people who have particular commitments to their nation. And the way this shows up in my students at Georgetown and everywhere I teach is I say, well, are you religious? And they say, no, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And we hear this all the time.
Yeah.
And so if you're religious, you're committed to a particular thing. If you're spiritual, you kind of hover over all the particular religions and say, well, I'm just committed to the universal thing in there, but I don't dare make a commitment to anything particular. And this is the fear I think so many of our students around the world have. They're fearful of committing to anything lest it be limiting on them. And so this cosmopolitan frame of mind promises so much, but ultimately you can't build anything on it. You can't build anything by being an anywhere. You can't just roam around the world. Eventually you have to make decisions about whether you're going to teach your kids about religion and which particular one, where you're going to live. We have to put down a footprint. And what Tocqueville saw is this would scare us all. And in part, we have to be clear why it would scare us all. So in the aristocratic age, he said we had roles and we had connections. And so we were bound through our roles. But he says the great accomplishment of the democratic age is that we move from being bearers of roles to being persons. And that's a fantastic thing, a person who can distance themselves from their roles. So that's a wonderful thing. But he said that's also frightening because we don't have anything that binds us, that holds us fast to anything. And so I think one way of seeing identity politics is it's a desperate attempt to say, I am this, and there's no way of arguing it. But Tocqueville viewed this as ultimately really, really destructive because far from allowing us then to build a world together, it sets up a barrier and says, you will either respect me, here's my identity, and my identity is the precondition of us working together. And that's not how a pluralistic society works. A pluralistic society works by bringing together people who have different, I don't like the word identity, but I'll use it here, different, my family is part Lebanese, part Welsh. But okay, so that's an opening round. You might announce that, but finally we discover who we are, not by announcing it in advance. We discover who we are by working together with people. So in encounters with others, who we are and who they are exceeds our imagination. And that's the way it should be. That's how you unleash this incredible energy never before found in human civilization. But with identity politics, you decide in advance who you are. And you say, here are the people I'm willing to talk to, and you have to accept me, and I have to be included. You have to accept the way I see myself. This is the pronoun wars. And that's the only way in which I'm going to talk with you. That's not how a democracy works. We bump into each other. We don't understand each other. And that's okay. We don't have to be fully transparent. We don't have to be fully authentic. But we learn as we go. And it's really this remarkable process, which can only happen if instead of putting up barriers between one another, we get to know one another.
Now, you mentioned identity politics. We looked at this concept of innocence and transgressors. You also talk about the visible and invisible economies. I wonder if you could just open that up a little bit.
One of the things that fascinates me is why conservatives have been unable to respond to this. I suppose I'm slightly right of center, but I call myself a liberal. And I'm right of center
in the classical sense, in essence.
Yeah, but even free markets, I'm not. Free markets, but if free markets end up destroying our middle class, then I'm not for free markets. I'm sorry.
Right, exactly.
I'm for protecting the middle class and for making sure the poor, those who are poor, can join the middle class. That to me ought to be our social policy. But what's fascinated me is how conservatives have been utterly unable to respond to identity politics. And you might remember that there have been these two conservatism, at least in America, and I think in Canada too, it's been comprised of two groups. One, the group that wants to defend free markets. This is classical liberals. And the other that wants to defend tradition. I'm going to go in two different directions on this. But think about it this way. Think about it in terms of how they understand debt. So if you're a classical liberal and you believe in free markets, you understand debt as literally money on a ledger book, right? You're either making money, you're losing money, your business goes out of business. If you're not making money, it's debt understood as cash, as what's on the ledger books. Traditionalists, this other wing of the conservative movement, understands debt as the debt we owe our fathers. Okay? So there's two understandings of debt. What I'm suggesting is that identity politics has a third understanding of debt. It's a deeper spiritual debt that can't be reduced to the debt we owe our fathers or the debt that's on a ledger book. This I think helps us explain why, for example, in America, this woman AOC and lots of other youngsters are saying, well, it doesn't matter if it costs $50 trillion to turn the US economy into a green economy. We have to do it. Now, anyone who's thinking about the real costs of things are going to say, well, this is crazy. You can't do that. But my point is, they're not thinking in terms of the economy, of the debt in the economy, of that kind of. They're thinking about a kind of spiritual debt based on our uncleanliness. And that uncleanliness has to be purged in order for us to live in a pure world. Now, this is a Christian idea. We have to be really clear about this. When Hillary Clinton talked about irredeemable stain, what she was saying is there's a debt, a payment, an impurity that you can't erase. And of course, Christianity talks about a debt that we owe God that we couldn't pay. And that's why Christ had to come into the world. God himself had to come into the world to pay the debt. Right. So what I'm saying is there are three understandings of debt at work here. Conservatives understand the first two, money, debt, the debt we owe our fathers. And because identity politics is really a kind of spiritual thing, it's a religious thing, it's pointing to a deeper debt. And I think it's actually, in that sense, it's important to pay attention to. And I think conservatives haven't really grasped this. There is a deeper kind of debt. If you're thinking theologically and you're thinking within the Christian orbit, you will say, yeah, there's a debt that the moneyed ledger can't get at, and even tradition can't get at. Let me give you an example from the Bible. So Judas betrays Christ. Yes, I talk about this a bit in the book. Why does Judas betray Christ? Well, because someone had brought oil that was very expensive, and I think it's Mary, rubs it on his feet. Right. And Judas, who is a social justice warrior, we have to be clear, he's a social justice warrior who believes that we can transform the society, that we can bring about social justice, but we just need the right money to do it. And so he realizes that Christ isn't going to bring that kind of a justice, and so he betrays him. So what Christ is announcing is that there's a deeper kind of spiritual thing going on here that money can't grasp, and Judas betrays him because he doesn't understand that. So there's all sorts of places in the New Testament itself where there's an understanding that there's a kind of debt, there's payments that we can't make. This is the idea of original sin. So what I'm saying is identity politics gets right that there's a deeper debt here, but it completely deforms how it is we should think about it. So the Christian answer is we can't pay it back. That's why Christ made the ultimate sacrifice. And what's happening with identity politics is they're alerting people to this irredeemable stain of whiteness, for example, right now, right? The debt that can't be paid off. And therefore, they want to purge whiteness, and they think that's the way to do this. This is setting up something incredibly dangerous. And here's the danger on the right. It's the alt-right. Because a lot of young men are saying, we're sick and tired of being told we have a stain that we can't erase. And so they're moving toward this alt-right position where they basically say, we don't care anymore. And so we're getting to a point in America where we're getting racial fatigue, which to me would be a terrible thing, because I do think the racial wound is an important one that we have to address.
I'm concerned about this idea of purging as well, because it seems like that both sides seem to be hardening on this, and that literally it could come to blows. And if the entire institutions, those institutions that hold back the winds of strife, as it were, whether it's the police force, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the, Congress itself, then even the church, I think the church has a role in holding back. If they all collapse, then it seems to me we're in for a free-for-all that's not going to be pretty, as you suggest.
Yeah, Barry, a couple of years ago, I never would have imagined it, but I'm starting to get very, very worried about this because, identity politics really, it says to everybody, it says there's guilt that you can't absolve. In America, there's racial guilt. In Europe, there's colonial guilt. There's the guilt surrounding the 2 world wars and guilt surrounding the Holocaust. And I say in the book that, all of this guilt really came to the surface after World War II. The Holocaust, the legacy of colonialism, slavery in America. When Walter Cronkite at CBS News broadcast the views of the videos of little black children getting thrown down the street by fire hoses, a lot of Americans just jumped up in their living rooms and said, no, this can't do. So what happened in the 1960s was that all this guilt hit. Identity politics hadn't yet formed yet. There was still some hope that through the churches, through the Great Society program, through modernization in the Third World, Europe could help repay its debt to its former colonies. None of that worked. And so here we are in the beginning of the 21st century with this incredible weight of guilt that lies on so many people's shoulders. And the question is, how do you absolve it? And now the left has a very simple way of doing this. I'm going to sound like I'm from the New Testament. Come unto me, all of you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Right. Renounce your nations, renounce your heteronormative families, renounce your homophobic church, renounce your monument, renounce your histories, and I will give you rest. So basically, the wager is everything that the West has created is racked with guilt and must be destroyed. That's the bet. And when the weight of guilt is so heavy and you have no way of taking care of it theologically, then you'll take care of it politically. Now, there are a lot of people, and some of them are Christians and some are not, who are saying, I don't want to renounce my families. I don't want to give up my monuments. I don't want to give up my church. Those people, they're not going to budge. And the problem, I think, on the left is that the left is not satisfied with just letting them be. The left insists that everyone has got to be purged. Everyone has to have their bad thoughts purged. And so, yes, we're going to come to blows at some point unless something gives. And my argument to folks on the left is that what they're looking for can't be found in identity politics. If they're looking to understand the issue of the innocent victim, there's one paradigmatic case of this. It's Christ. He is the paradigmatic innocent victim. If you're looking to solve the problem of irredeemable stain, Christianity is the first religion to talk about irredeemable stain. It was Athanasius and Augustine in the 3rd and 4th centuries talking about original sin. If you want to figure out the moral economy of stain and innocence, it's not this horizontal relationship between different groups and different groups with different intersectional scores. The Christian response is, this is a vertical relationship. Christ is the only the innocent victim, and all the rest of us are stained. Whereas what identity politics does is it moves the axis by 90 degrees and says, no, here are the innocent victims and everybody else is stained. And I don't think to come back to our original point, and it's really the Tocquevillian point, you can't build a world of competence when the only thing we're looking at is who's the innocent victim. And of course, let me add one other thing. And only the innocent victim has a right to speak. So I teach the history of Western political thought. I guess you could say it's dead white men, but Augustine was a Tunisian. The degrees of distinction among all these people is astounding. Europe went to war for thousands of years. These are not white people who agree with one another. These are nations that hated each other and religious groups that hated each other. So, but nevertheless, with the brush of identity politics, this is all whiteness, and so we have to purge the history of Western political thought. We can't teach it anymore. It's guilty of transgression. And so the whole university has to be reconfigured. You're probably seeing that in Canada. I'm absolutely seeing this in the United States. We have to purge Shakespeare. We have to purge Milton. These are all just dead white guys. You can't build a civilization on this sort of thing. Martin Luther King wanted blacks to be admitted to the University of Alabama so that they too could share the treasures of Western civilization, so that they too could read Shakespeare. That's a very different understanding of how we solve the problem. And now the understanding is the way we solve the problem is that we have to purge Shakespeare and purge Milton. You can't build a civilization on never-ending destruction. But that's what identity politics does, because it sees stain everywhere.
As you're talking here, I'm thinking of all kinds of examples of this very thing that's going on. We had a current prime minister who, back about this time last year, there was a First Nations reserve in British Columbia that someone had done a survey of a property that was once a residential school, and they found 200 and some odd unmarked graves. But as I've spoken to a lot of friends of mine in the Catholic community, they pointed out, that, yes, there's a horrible tragedy went on with these young people who were brought in from the reserves up north and brought into these residential schools, and a number of them died while they're in residence. And then they would simply bury the child, put a wooden cross on them, and then, of course, over time, disintegrates, and there's no record as to where the child was buried and all of that kind of thing. But then the New York Times, in reporting on this find, referred to it as a mass grave. And I mean, when we think of mass graves, we get visions of a Nazi era lining people up and filling in hundreds of people.
Right.
And then it just became an absolute scourge, so that churches across some estimates, probably close to 100 churches were either vandalized. There was a number, 60 some that were burned last summer here in Canada. And a number of them were churches on reserves, and the First Nations people were telling the social activists, look, stop burning our churches. These are our churches. Yeah. And yet, this went on. The monuments were attacked. The prime minister lowered the Canadian flag for 5 months. I mean, again, it's that idea of this guilt. Canada is not one to be, its history is not to be favored or in any way. Patriotism is horrible. And we get the same kind of angst with respect to the collective guilt. And again, the same outline as you point out, it's the heterosexual white male who's the problem of all of these things.
Well, let me add to this. So our parallel, as you know, is the George Floyd killing and things like that. If you look at the statistics, black on black violence is an extraordinarily big problem. And even if you run the numbers and, ask the question, are blacks disproportionately killed by police officers? Turns out that's not true. But these things have a kind of symbolic significance. And I want to be clear, they have a symbolic significance for guilty white liberals. The defund the police movement, for example, in America, this is not something that blacks in the inner city want. This is something the guilty white liberals want. We now have ample evidence of extraordinary build-up in terms of crime in the United States. I mean, more murders all over the place as a consequence of the defund the police. This is, to use my friend Bob Woodson's language, these are people who live in distant zip codes, right? These are outside people who come in. And I should point out something I haven't developed here, but is implicit in all that I've said. So let's presume that you are white, and you believe that that you're guilty. What do? Well, the first thing you do is you have to distance yourself from those other white people. I mean, the way I put it in the book is there's the right kind of white man and there's the wrong kind of white man. And I think the Trump presidency revealed this very, very clearly. And, there are a lot of people who voted for Trump, as you know, and a lot of people voted for him not because they had great confidence in him, but that they were scared to death of what the Democratic Party was going to do. And so even those who voted for them, I think my venture, based on my own kind of anecdotal survey, is more than half of them didn't particularly love him, but they thought the alternative was worse. So, but what Trump came to represent for CNN and National Public Radio and all the other guilty white liberal groups is the wrong kind of white man. He couldn't exist in the world of identity politics. For that reason, we had to invent a demonic source for him, namely the Russia collusion. Trump derangement syndrome is very, very real. You have, I remember this very well, you would go to faculty meetings or go over to people's houses, and the very first thing that they had to do, almost after they said hello, was say something disparaging about Trump or about the people who voted for him. So my argument is you actually do have a race war in America. It's between whites and blacks. Because I work with a group of Black conservatives, and it's very clear in talking with them that they are invisible. For all the talk about diversity, they are a group that cannot exist, these Black conservatives cannot exist in the world of identity politics. Clarence Thomas, for example, our Supreme Court Justice, has been said, it's been said about him that he's really not a Black man, right? So we have to bring in somebody who's really Black. Have you ever heard of Sylvia Bennett Stone?
No.
Her daughter, who was 19 years old, was driving down the street and stopped at a gas station to get gas and was caught in crossfire between two black gangs. Body went through her body, killed her instantly, went into her girlfriend's heart and killed her. And so Sylvia Bennett Stone started a group called, I think it's Black Mothers United or something like this.
Okay.
You'll never hear about it. There's going to be a long television show about them. These are mothers who've lost their children to black on black violence. And their argument is we need more police, not less police. But, if you believe that America is systemically racist or Canada is systemically racist, you will take one case and you'll make it stand for the whole. Right. And you won't be able to see the other evidence that suggests, no, it's a much more nuanced story. And that I think is one of the deepest pathologies of all this. Look, identity politics claims that certain groups of people have been ruled out and silenced, that innocent voices have been excluded. And as a good liberal, my view is bring them all in. Everybody should have a seat at the table. Right. But the irony of identity politics is that actually it silences half of the Black population. It will never bring Sylvia Bennett Stone on CNN. They will never bring Bob Woodson and Glenn Loury. They will never bring these Black conservatives on CNN who will give a counter narrative. To be a woman, you have to be committed to feminism and pro-choice. To be a man, you have to do everything you can to admit that you're a racist, which is why you go through never-ending diversity, equity, and inclusion training, which is why you put a Black Lives Matter sign in your front yard. And I'll come back to something I said but didn't develop. My view is, yes, race is a big issue. Here I may differ from a number of conservatives. I think we have to address the race issue. It will not be addressed by putting Black Lives Matter signs on your front yard and giving you moral absolution, or painting a Black Lives sign on the street of your town. That doesn't give you moral absolution. There are real problems we have, and there are real concrete ways to do them. Turns out Tocqueville shows us the way we can address these issues. Namely, what we should do in our local communities is look for those in distressed communities who have somehow transformed their lives and are the key pillars of the community, and you go quietly say, how can I help? And Bob Woodson developed this in a book called The Triumphs of Joseph. It's a biblical model. The Pharaoh is the wealthy one. He finds the Joseph, the former slave who's competent, and he says, I empower you. Here's money. Tell me how I can help. This is not through state programs, but through actual philanthropy in your communities. And I'm sick and tired of my students around the world talking about their own white privilege. And they think that if they do that, then they're absolved. They just admit they're tacitly racist, and then everything's fine. That is not the case. If you really want to solve problems, stop separating people between black and white. Find the least among us who need help, and help them.
It reminds me of comments of Thomas Sowell, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He said that when he was growing up in New York, that there was, families were together, but when the whites came in to fix the problems of the black community, then that's when the families broke apart.
Yeah. So the story that you get told by the left is that slavery led to Jim Crow, led to the current situation where there are disparities. But Thomas Sowell is one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century. He's 90 years old now. I just attended a conference in Dallas, which was the 40th anniversary of a conference that he did. It's a famous conference of black conservatives at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco in 1982, I guess it would have been. He was the honored guest, although he couldn't show up because he's 93 years old. But Thomas Sowell, Bob Woodson, Glenn Lowry, they say what happened was that the history of black success was erased after the Great Society programs emerged, because what you had to have was a narrative that said blacks are innocent victims and only more state programs can support us, can help them. And what Bob Woodson and Glenn Lowry and Thomas Sowell point out is precisely because the state was not their friend, Black America did exactly what Tocqueville said we all need to do, was they became a nation of joiners. They built all sorts of clubs and associations because the state wasn't going to help them. So they were, in a way, the best Tocquevillian citizens after the Civil War. They didn't have the help of the state, so they had to do this collectively. And so marriage rates rivaled white rates very soon after the Civil War. Blacks understood that it was the families and the churches, not the state, that was going to save them. And when Martin Luther King in the late 50s and early 60s was talking about political redress, he was not saying the state should become a substitute for families and churches, but rather should supplement it. The pathology of the Great Society program was that it became a substitute for it. And it encouraged out of wedlock births. And so now the Black man has no place really in Black society because Black women go to the state for aid. This was deliberately done. I don't think it was done maliciously, but it was with a view to helping. And Jason Riley and others said, look, white America, stop helping us because it's done out of guilt. We're fully capable of becoming full citizens, just like you. Just stop using us for your liberal guilt, which takes the form of defund the police in the places where the police are most needed, et cetera. So guilty white liberals are a huge problem in America, and I would suggest in Canada as well. Remember, if you're white, you've got this unbelievable burden of guilt, unless you realize the whole thing is insane, which I think I think it's completely insane. My view is collective guilt gets us nowhere. We have collective responsibility for the least among us. Yeah. And by collective responsibility, I don't mean the state. I mean individuals in their local communities. I think we have an obligation through philanthropy to do everything we possibly can to help the least among us. But collective guilt is a cancer, and I completely reject it. And that's the real message of the 1619 Project, which you and your readers have probably heard about.
Yes.
We can argue about America, the origins, the Jamestown colony, whether that's the origin, whether the slavery. But frankly, that's not, to me, what's important about that project. The real importance of that project is the claim that America is so systemically racist that you can't help yourself, your friends can't help you, your families can't help you, your churches can't help you, only the state can help you. That, to me, is a message of despair to Black America. It's an anti-Tocquevillian message. The real message we have to get out there is, why don't we see what we can do together?
I want to come back real quick to two other points you make very strongly. One is the oscillating bipolar, as it were, nature of what we're going through right now, feeling invincible on one hand, but then feeling impotent on the other hand. I want to unpack that a wee bit, and also the concept of being addicted to shortcuts. Then I wanted to finally talk about, okay, where do we go from here?
The book is divided into three parts. The first one is on identity politics, which is, I think, received the most press, but the other two issues I think are very, very real. I'm concerned with health. I'm concerned with social and political health. And so I'm always trying to find diseases. And as we know, manic depression is a kind of disease.
Yeah.
As I said to you earlier, Tocqueville did see this coming. He has this wonderful passage toward the end of the book, Democracy in America, where he says, I foresee a time coming when in the democratic age, we will see ourselves as greater than kings and less than men. And less than. It's an extraordinary passage. In other words, by virtue of breaking the links between us and other people, we're going to feel that we're completely sovereign. And I think Facebook shows this, right? If somebody doesn't like what you do, you just defriend them.
Yeah.
So to use my phrase, we're all selfie men now. Everybody's taking pictures. The world is the background for their selfies. So in that sense, everybody feels completely sovereign through social media. And yet what goes along with that, and as a consequence also of breaking the links, is a sense of utter impotence and anonymity. And so students, young people feel utterly sovereign through social media. And then you ask them, are they going to vote? And they say, well, no, because nothing I can contribute to will do any good. All of our problems are transnational problems. When I hear the word crisis, I think, well, this is really a power grab for transnationalism. On the climate change, for example, my view is, okay, if there's a problem, we'll solve this not by establishing in advance what the technologies are and who the corporate winners are. Let's just say, hey, we got this problem. Let's unleash this entrepreneurial spirit from the bottom up and see what we come up with in the name of new technologies, et cetera. But this oscillation back and forth is a serious problem. And Tocqueville thought the only remedy for this was that we build a world together with our neighbors. And I tell my students who come to me routinely and say, Professor Mitchell, I'm addicted. I have this immense sense of power through social media, and yet I feel completely impotent. And I tell them, you have to go cold turkey. You literally have to get off of social media and don't text your friend and ask if you can call them. Call them. You've got a younger generation who is afraid even to do anything spontaneous. You can't build a world if you're afraid to get on the phone and call your friend, even if it's the wrong time of day. None of us are so busy that we can't say, hey, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. And this is my recommendation for all of us. Get off of email, get on the phone, and I don't mean text messaging. So the only antidote to the problem of bipolarity, in my view, is reconnecting with other people. Tocqueville says, one of my favorite passages, feelings and ideas are renewed, the heart enlarged, the mind expanded only by the reciprocal actions of men one upon another. The only way we build a world together is in these face-to-face relations, and we're giving up on them and looking up to the powerful state, and the state can't save us. On the matter of addiction, so I actually came up with a word for it, and I'm not fully satisfied with the word. I called it substitutism, and I want to lay this out just briefly. So my argument is, and it's not mine, it's in Plato's Republic, it's in Rousseau, it's in a number of people, it's lurking in Tocqueville as well. My argument is we have to make a distinction between supplements and substitutes. I'll give you a quick example. So we have a good meal, and then we can have supplements to it. Of course, the supplement industry, as you know, in North America and Europe is just huge, vitamins and protein powders and all these things. And the supplements can enhance the meal, but they can't become a substitute for the meal. The way Rousseau saw this is in terms of courage. And then I want to come to friendship briefly to lay this out more fully. He thought a weapon can supplement your courage, but a weapon can't be a substitute for your courage. And his argument was we in the modern world are going to choose all these shortcuts. Well, let me do friendship. So friendship is a really difficult art. It's connoisseurship. It's a competence. Not clear to me that there's a book that tells you how to do it. If you know what it is, then maybe you can read about it, but you have to know something about it first. And nobody can teach you. You just have to do it. Social media, Facebook friends are a supplement to friendship. If you know what friendship is, then you can get on and develop Facebook friendships, and you can even do Zoom meetings and things like this. But you have to first know what the meal is, which is friendship. And my argument is that everywhere we look, and Facebook is really the example of this, We're turning supplements into substitutes. We're not doing the hard work of developing friendships anymore. We're just saying, well, I've got a Facebook friend, or I've got a social media friend. And so the hard work of being a human being, which is making a meal, which is developing friendship, which is not online shopping, but shopping, which is itself a connoisseurship. All of these things are being given up. And so, for example, driverless cars is another dream, right? We want to have driverless cars. I don't want driverless cars as a substitute, because if we don't have people who have the competence of driving, what happens when the state decides you're the enemy? A car doesn't show up at your door and you starve to death. But this is the dream, what I call substitutism. We can get past this. And here's another example. The nation should have supplements like transnational treaties and things like that. But cosmopolitanism is a supplement to the nation, not a substitute for it, right? The state is a supplement to our mediating institutions, not a substitute for it. And then I think the big one is the digital world can be a supplement to the analog world of time and place, but can't be a substitute for it. But that's exactly the dream that now people like Mark Zuckerberg, who's building the metaverse, have, that we can turn supplements into substitutes. And that is like addiction, because addiction is where you take a drug that should be a supplement to your everyday life and you turn it into a substitute for everyday life. So I'm suggesting that everywhere we look in these very disparate areas, we're all involved in finding cheap shortcuts. And it's bigger than politics. It's not that people on the left are doing this and people on the right aren't doing this. This is beyond politics. Everybody's involved in finding cheap shortcuts and turning supplements into substitutes. And to come back to Tocqueville, maybe we can end on this. What Tocqueville saw was the hard work of becoming a human being, of developing the competence of friendship, the developing the competence of driving a car, developing the competence of leading a group. You can't learn this online. You have to learn it live, real time, in the mediating institutions that stand between the lonely, isolated citizen and the powerful state. So if only our mediating institutions can save us, and yet not only because identity politics is attacking them, but because we're looking for cheap shortcuts, we're all abandoning these mediating institutions. And if Tocqueville's right, this will lead us to the kinder and gentler despotism at the end of history.
Right now, a lot of people just simply do not have the tools to be able to just even recognize the struggle that we're finding ourselves. And it seems to me that a lot of what we're experiencing, people with the lack of history, with the absolute throwing out of the wisdom of the past ages and all the rest of it, there's this crazy concept of, as you've heard Dr. Mitchell talk about the experiences of the French Revolution that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about, and how that resonates with our time right now. And I'd encourage you, those of you who are watching, to please get yourself a copy of this very important book. It's important for our time that you understand what is at stake in the here and now. Dr. Mitchell, I just want to thank you so very much for being generous with your time, taking the time to come and talk to us. If there's any last word that you would like to share with our viewers and listeners.
So I'm actually hopeful. My view is that, so what I ask my students is this: how's this working for you? You get this high of being able to call out people for being stained. You think of yourself as a sovereign self, but I know what happens when you're alone and in private, which is you feel lonely, you feel impotent. Maybe the thing that you think is going to save you isn't. And so my view is, if we can start by reaching out to our neighbor and discovering that who they are exceeds our expectation, and as a consequence, who we think we are exceeds our expectation, I think that's the road back. We have to go back to the meal. We have to go back to real friendship. We have to go back to embodied life. It's not perfect. It has its limitations, but it's the best possible thing that we can have in order to live in this broken world that we have inherited. But it's our world, and it can be beautiful. It's got a mixed legacy, to be sure, but you don't throw something out because it has a mixed legacy. You try to redeem it.
Well, thank you so much again for your words of wisdom. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in to Freedom Feature. And as I say in virtually every program, that you may not agree with the ideas that are being expressed by me or my special guests, But that's the whole purpose of Freedom Feature. It's helping us to get back to the basic understandings of things. And one of those basic understandings is for us to communicate. We want open, fair, transparent, honest communication so that we can be able to discuss the issues of our time. And until next time, I'm Barry Bussey. The fight for freedom consists not only in the legal battles in court, but also in the battle of ideas at the universities and in the media. It takes time, effort, and money to keep on top of the debates for freedom. Your donation allows us to keep fighting for all Canadians. Firstfreedoms.ca